American experience of homicide, death is a way of life.
Death is a way of life in the American experience.
I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, which is a small city of about 750,000 people. This year, Baltimore will have about 350 homicides.
I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, which is a population of about 750,000, and this year we will have 3,500 homicides.
Much of my research has been on homicide, much of it has been on homicide in Baltimore. So let's talk a little bit about a murder in America.
Much of my experience and expertise is about Baltimore, so let's talk about one murder in America.
Example number one, July 14th, 1992, in Baltimore, Maryland, 8 people were shot. But there's nothing unusual about that. We have 8 people shot probably a dozen times a year.
In July 14th, 1992, 8 people in Baltimore were shot, and that's not that big of a deal because we have 8 people shot every day.
2 of them died. 2 homicides in one day, but there was nothing unusual about that. That happens about 50 times a year in Baltimore.
2 of those people died. We have about 50 times that 2 people die in Baltimore a year.
Is that both of those people who died for the same reason, the same motive. They stepped on the offender's toes.
Both people who died stepped on the offender's toes.
The American experience of homicide is dying because you stepped on somebody's toes.
The American experience is that people die because you stepped on someone's toes.
Other reasons that turned up in my research, he turned up the heat. I didn't want him to, so I shot him. He was talking to my girlfriend. He put his hand on my girlfriend's butt, or he looked at me, so he shot him.
My research also shows that people get shot for talking to their girlfriend or touching them on the butt, so, turning up the heat, so one person shot the other.
Example number 2. The best known gun battle in American history is the gunfight at the OK Corral. It wasn't much of a gunfight, actually. The Herb brothers just pretty well shot some people down, but it's famous. 9 men, and in about 1 minute, 35 rounds were fired, 35 bullets.
The most famous gun battle happened at the OK Corral, where 9 gunslingers shot 35 rounds, but it wasn't that big of a gun show.
1992, police were called to a shooting in Baltimore, Maryland, where, as the officer said, he found the drug dealer with the 2 guns smoking at his feet. He was dead. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, but had finally been shot through the head.
In July of 1992, the drug dealer had 2 guns still smoking at his side. The policeman had a bulletproof vest, but then he was shot through the head.
2 men, one of whom had a fully automatic weapon. He had 2 semi-automatic weapons, and in the space of less than 20 seconds, 65 rounds were fired.
There were 2 semi-automatic rifles used, and in less than 20 seconds, 65 rounds were shot.
The experience of homicide in the United States, then, is 65 bullets flying through the air of an American city in the middle of the afternoon.
So that means 65 bullets were flying through the air on an American afternoon.
Throughout this, I will stress how social group specific homicide is, and I will try to explain the increase in homicide since 1968, pointing out that it has not been spread evenly across the social groups of America.
My research goes from 1968, and it shows how gun violence is not spread evenly across social and racial groups.
I want to do 2 things. First, I want to present a picture of what we think we know about homicide in the United States, focusing on the changes since 1968. And then I want to focus on the characteristics that will help us to understand the higher homicide rates and to understand the difference in homicides that have occurred since that time. I will focus on firearms and on the culture of violence.
Oh my God, that one was long. I'm gonna focus on two things, and gun violence, and that was horrible.
First, talking about rates of homicide over the past 50 years. From 1940 to 1968, there was a relatively normal homicide rate in the United States. Never went below 6 per 100,000. It never went above, or never went below 4 per 100,000. Never went above 6 per 100,000. Very stable, very predictable, very much like European rates.
The death rate by guns from 1940 to 1968 was very stable and very comparable to the gun rate violence in Europe. 6% for every 1,000 people.
But in 1968, those rates started to go up, and the increase has been dramatic, and it has been steep. In 1980, it was 10 per 100,000.
In 1980, from 1968 to 1980, the gun violence went up.
For 30 years, the homicide rates in the United States did not change, and then in 10 years, they more than doubled.
For 30 years, the gun rate violence was the same, and then in the next 10 years, the gun violence rate more than doubled.
First, take as a normal base those normal homicides. The husband killing his wife, as I say to my Swiss friends when I do this in Switzerland, the farmer in Appenzell, the Austrian farmer in Tyrol, or as you would say in Maryland, the farmer in Hagerstown, who spends 40 years nagging his wife, and after 40 years finally comes in and she's had it, and he says something to her, and she takes the frying pan and brains him.
So there's the typical murder where the husband kills the wife, where it's the farmer. Is if you're in Maryland, it's from Hagerstown, and the farmer's been nagging the wife for 40 years, and then she suddenly gets sick of it, and she takes a frying pan and smashes him in the head.
Normal fights. Two friends who go into a bar, get into an argument about who the greatest baseball team in history was, and one of them winds up dead. Normal homicides.
Another normal homicide is when two friends go into a bar and they're talking about the greatest baseball player ever, and they get in an argument, and then one ends up
They have
dead.
stable characteristics and have had for years. It's a male activity. About 85% of all of them are male, both as offender and as victim. They are poor, both relative and absolute. They tend to be urban homicides, and they involve friends or family about 70% of the time. That's in the United States and in Austria.
In the United States and Austria, 85% of people who shoot or are shot are men. They tend to be poor and in urban
But
situations.
since 1968, there have been changes that have occurred in a superstructure, the kinds of homicides built on top of that. One of the things that has changed most dramatically has been a change in relationships between offenders and victims.
One thing that has changed is the relationship between the offender and the victim in the last 10 years.
There's some problems with coding, but I'm not going to go into that. Let's talk about what really shows up. In cities in the United States, about 50% of all of the homicides now involve strangers or enemies, not friends or family.
What's happening now is that in the cities, the homicides are occurring with strangers or people that don't know each other. There's some information about coding, but I'm not going to get into that.
So the base is still there, but these new homicides are building on top of them. That base is where we've always like kills like. You always hurt the one you love, you usually kill somebody like you. Same age, same group, same sex, same social class.
You tend to kill people like you, same gender, same social class, your friends.
So we've always been able to use victim data to also tell us about offenders. But the Baltimore data and some data that's from St. Louis, some data that's from Chicago, has both offenders and victims by case, and we've been able to see some problems coming.
We can learn information about the offenders based on information from the victims. So we are gathering data from Baltimore, Chicago, and St. Louis to study the patterns of gun violence.